A stewardess snaps. A billionaire strikes back. What unfolded at 35,000 feet will leave you stunned. The cabin lights flickered softly as the plane battled turbulence over the Midwest. It was past midnight, the kind of hour where tempers flared and patience wore thin. Most of the passengers in first class had sunk into their plush seats, earbuds in or eyes closed. But not him. Sitting in seat 1A was a man impossible to ignore. Malcolm Pierce, charismatic, wealthy, and unapologetically blunt. His voice carried over the hum of the engines as he debated with a flight attendant over something as mundane as a cup of coffee. "I'm not asking for much," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. "Just hot coffee that isn't burnt. Is that so difficult?" Emily Brennan, the stewardess on duty, clenched her teeth behind a polite smile. She was in her early 40s, a veteran of the skies, and tonight she was running on nothing but adrenaline and stale airline snacks. The turbulence wasn't helping her balance or her mood. "Mr. Pierce, I'll get you a fresh cup," she said, her voice tight. "Just give me a moment." "You've had moments," he shot back. "Plenty of them. What I haven't had is decent service for the amount I paid for this seat." Passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, some pretending not to hear, while others leaned in to catch every word. Emily turned on her heel, muttering under her breath as she headed toward the galley. She wasn't angry just at him. Her frustration stemmed from hours of non-stop demands, the kind that slowly chipped away at her patience. Malcolm's complaint was the tipping point, but she wasn't the only one at a breaking point. By the time she returned with the coffee, Malcolm was engrossed in his phone, tapping out an email with rapid precision. He barely acknowledged her as she placed the cup on the tray table. "Finally," he muttered, but loud enough for her to hear. Something inside her snapped. She stood there for a beat too long, staring at him as if weighing an unspoken decision. The passengers closest to them began to notice, their curiosity piqued. "You're welcome," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. He looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she replied, her tone now unmistakably confrontational. Before he could respond, the plane shuddered with another jolt of turbulence, making the tension in the cabin feel almost electric. But Malcolm wasn't one to let things go, and Emily wasn't ready to back down. This moment was about to spiral into something no one on that flight would forget. Emily leaned against the galley counter, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to calm down. This wasn't the first time a passenger had been demanding, nor would it be the last. But something about tonight had her teetering on the edge. She thought about her morning, her teenage son refusing to get out of bed for school, her elderly mother calling to remind her of an overdue doctor's appointment she'd missed, and the stack of unpaid bills sitting on her kitchen counter. Life at home felt like chaos, and now, at 35,000 feet, the chaos had followed her. Malcolm Pierce, on the other hand, seemed to have everything figured out. A billionaire entrepreneur with a face that had graced magazine covers and television screens, he was the kind of man people either admired or resented. His booming tech company was the stuff of Silicon Valley legend, and his larger-than-life personality often made headlines. He was used to getting his way. His money ensured that much. But tonight, Malcolm wasn't in a particularly generous mood. His flight to Seattle had already been delayed, the turbulence had turned his meal into a mess, and now he was nursing what he considered an insultingly bad cup of coffee. To him, the situation was unacceptable, and he wasn't shy about making it known. Emily returned to the aisle, trying to focus on her duties, but her mind kept replaying Malcolm's dismissive tone. "Finally," he had said, as if she were nothing more than a servant at his beck and call. She had been trained to handle difficult passengers, to remain composed no matter the situation. But tonight, she felt more like a volcano ready to erupt. As she passed by the first-class cabin, she noticed Malcolm waving her over again. Reluctantly, she approached, plastering on her professional smile. "This coffee is still bad," he said, holding the cup out toward her. "Do you not know how to brew it? Or is this some kind of personal vendetta? The comment stung. Her smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure. I assure you, Mr. Pierce, it's not personal. Let me see what I can do. But he didn't stop. Maybe you should consider another line of work if something as simple as coffee is beyond your abilities. Nearby passengers tried to avoid eye contact, but their curiosity was impossible to hide. Malcolm's words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. Emily felt her face flush with heat. Years of training told her to walk away, to breathe through the anger and maintain her professionalism. But tonight, the weight of her personal life, the turbulence, and now Malcolm's relentless criticism pushed her closer to the edge. She met his gaze, her voice calm, but with an unmistakable edge. Is there anything else I can get for you, Mr. Pierce? Or will this be enough to ruin your evening? Malcolm smirked, leaning back in his seat. You tell me. You're the expert in ruining things. A small gasp came from a passenger in the second row. The tension in the cabin had reached its peak, and Emily could feel every pair of eyes on her. She opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by another sharp jolt of turbulence that sent her stumbling slightly. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breathing quickened, and for a moment she felt completely untethered. She clenched her fists at her sides, her thoughts a whirlwind of anger and frustration. But this wasn't just about a bad cup of coffee anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and how much one person could take before they reached their breaking point. The plane shook again, a jarring drop that elicited gasps and clutching hands from the passengers. Emily steadied herself, gripping the edge of Malcolm's seat for balance. She glanced at his smug expression, the way he casually sipped the coffee she'd just brought him, and something inside her snapped. Without thinking, without planning, her hand lashed out. The slap echoed through the cabin like a crack of thunder. Malcolm's head jerked to the side, his sunglasses, more of a statement piece than a necessity at this hour, tilted askew. Gasps rippled through the first-class cabin. A woman in row 2 dropped her tablet, the thud barely audible over the stunned silence. The man in seat 3C muttered, "Oh my God," under his breath. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background. Emily's hand tingled, her pulse pounding in her ears. She froze, unable to process what she had just done. Her training, her years of professionalism, all of it evaporated in an instant. Malcolm slowly turned his head back to face her. His cheek bore the faint red imprint of her hand, but his expression was unreadable. He didn't yell. He didn't stand. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, adjusted his sunglasses, and gave her a slow, deliberate smile. "Bold move," he said, his voice calm and steady, which only made the moment more unnerving. "You're going to regret that." Emily took a shaky step back, her mind racing. Passengers whispered among themselves, their faces a mix of shock and fascination. The flight attendant in the galley peeked out cautiously, her wide eyes meeting Emily's. Emily began, but her voice cracked. She swallowed hard, trying again. "Mr. Pierce, I'm so sorry. That was—" Malcolm raised a hand, cutting her off. "Save it. You've already made your statement." For a moment Emily thought he might lash out, demand she be restrained, or call the pilot to report her. But instead, Malcolm stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored jacket. He glanced around the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the other passengers as if he were sizing them up. 2 minutes, he said, his voice low but commanding enough to carry across the cabin. "Give me 2 minutes." And with that, he walked toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain that separated first class from the cockpit area. The air felt heavier in his absence, the whispers growing louder as the shock began to settle into curiosity. "What's he going to do?" someone murmured. "Is he going to get her fired?" another passenger whispered. Emily stood rooted in place, her hand still trembling. She wanted to run, to hide, to rewind time and undo what she had just done. But instead, she found herself staring at the curtain, dreading what Malcolm might do when he returned. 2 minutes felt like an eternity. The plane's turbulence had eased, but the tension in the cabin was thicker than ever. Emily's mind raced through possibilities. He could demand her termination, sue the airline, or worse. She had no idea what to expect. The galley phone rang, jolting her out of her thoughts. The other flight attendant answered, nodding nervously before glancing at Emily. "He's asking for the passenger manifest," she said in a hushed tone. Emily's stomach sank. The passenger manifest. Why would he need that? Her heart pounded as the possibilities grew darker. Was he planning to involve every passenger in whatever revenge he was plotting? But Malcolm wasn't the kind of man to act impulsively. He was deliberate, calculated, and that made what was coming next even more terrifying. The curtain separating the first-class cabin from the front of the plane shifted, and Malcolm reappeared. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely too calm. He held a small notebook and pen in his hand, something he must have retrieved during his brief absence. Emily watched him with a mixture of dread and confusion. The passengers fell silent as he returned to his seat, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the cabin. Malcolm didn't immediately sit down. Instead, he turned to face the rows of passengers, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth but firm. "I apologize for the disruption earlier. However, I believe we've stumbled upon an opportunity, a moment that says a lot about us, about our assumptions, and about what happens when people forget their humanity." Emily felt her chest tighten. Was he turning this into some kind of speech? She wanted to disappear, to shrink into the galley and pretend this was all a bad dream. Malcolm gestured toward Emily without looking at her. "You all saw what happened. You saw how someone tasked with serving others lost control. And I don't blame her. Not entirely. Because what happened here isn't just about her. It's about a system that grinds people down until they can't take it anymore." The passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Some nodded slightly, as if trying to understand where he was going with this. Emily, meanwhile, felt her cheeks burn with a mix of humiliation and anger. How dare he turn this into a public spectacle? Malcolm finally sat down, opening the notebook on his lap. "But I'm a man who believes in accountability, not just for her, but for myself. So here's what I'm going to do." He began writing, his pen scratching against the paper. The sound seemed deafening in the otherwise silent cabin. After a moment, he ripped out a page and held it up for everyone to see. "This," he said, "is a $5,000 donation to a non-profit of her choice." He glanced at Emily for the first time since the slap, his expression unreadable. "To remind myself that even when I'm disrespected, I can choose grace." Emily blinked, stunned. She wasn't sure if this was an act of kindness or a calculated move to make her feel small. Before she could respond, Malcolm tore out another page. "This," he continued, "is a $5,000 donation to an organization that supports flight attendants and airline workers. Because clearly, the stress of this job is something most of us can't imagine." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Some appeared impressed, others skeptical. Emily's mind raced. Was this his way of apologizing, or was it a power play meant to remind everyone of his wealth and influence? Malcolm wasn't finished. He tore out one more page, holding it up like a trophy. "And this is my personal promise. Every passenger in this cabin will receive a $1,000 travel voucher on me." The whispers turned into audible gasps. A man in row 3 clapped, and soon others joined in, hesitant at first but growing louder. Malcolm raised a hand to silence them. "But," he said, his voice cutting through the applause, "there's one more thing I need to do." He stood again, this time turning to Emily directly. "Miss Brennan, I'd like to ask you a question." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Yes, Mr. Pierce? What do you think made you snap tonight? Was it me? The turbulence? Or was it something deeper?" The question hung in the air, heavy and personal. Emily's heart raced as all eyes turned to her. She felt trapped, like an insect pinned under a magnifying glass. But there was no escaping the moment. "It's everything," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The stress, the demands, feeling invisible. You just happened to be the last straw." Malcolm nodded thoughtfully, as if he'd expected the answer. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. "And thank you for reminding me that even people who seem strong can be fragile." He extended his hand toward her. For a moment, Emily hesitated, unsure if this was another power move or a genuine olive branch. Finally, she reached out and shook it, her hand trembling slightly. As he sat back down, Malcolm addressed the cabin one last time. "Let this be a lesson for all of us. Power doesn't come from money or status. It comes from how we treat one another. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is show compassion." The cabin erupted in applause again, this time louder and more genuine. Emily stood frozen, unsure how to process what had just happened. The slap, the donations, the speech, it all felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But Malcolm's words lingered in her mind, making her wonder if this moment, as painful as it was, might actually change the way she saw herself and others. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted dramatically. The whispers had subsided, replaced by a hum of contemplation. Passengers who had initially viewed Malcolm as arrogant were now stealing glances of admiration. Some exchanged quiet conversations about his speech, while others scribbled notes, possibly inspired by his unexpected generosity. Emily sat in the galley, her back against the wall, knees drawn to her chest. She stared at her hands, replaying the events of the night in her mind. The slap, the stunned silence, and then the billionaire's calm, calculated response. She couldn't decide if she felt humbled, humiliated, or something in between. She glanced at the folded pieces of paper Malcolm had handed her earlier. The first two were the promised donation receipts, one to a non-profit of her choice and the other to an organization supporting airline workers. The third was a personal note, handwritten in neat, precise letters. "Sometimes it takes a moment of chaos to remind us what matters most. I hope this night inspires you to take care of yourself the way you take care of others." The message hit her harder than the applause or the donations. It felt personal, sincere, and entirely unexpected. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket, unsure if she'd ever find the courage to thank him. As the plane touched down, the flight crew prepared for landing. Malcolm remained seated, a picture of calm, while the passengers around him buzzed with quiet admiration. When the seatbelt sign turned off, he stood, collected his carry-on, and turned to Emily one last time. "Take care of yourself, Miss Brennan," he said softly, his tone devoid of the earlier sharpness. "You're stronger than you think." Emily nodded, words failing her. For the first time that night, she felt seen, not as a stewardess, but as a person. Malcolm exited the plane, disappearing into the crowd of travelers. The first-class passengers followed, some offering Emily sympathetic smiles or murmured words of support. She felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and a flicker of something that felt like hope. As she walked through the cabin for the final cleanup, she noticed something on Malcolm's seat. A business card rested neatly on the armrest, his name embossed in sleek silver lettering. On the back he had scrawled another note: "Let me know if you ever need help chasing your dreams." Emily stared at the card, her mind racing. Was this his way of making amends, or was it an invitation to take control of her life? She didn't know, but for the first time in a long while, She felt like she had options. That night, as she drove home, the events of the flight replayed in her mind. She thought about the slap, the stunned silence, and the billionaire's words. It was a moment she would never forget, not because of the embarrassment, but because it forced her to confront truths she had been avoiding. Life was hard. People were complicated. But dignity, respect, and compassion mattered more than anything else. Malcolm's response could have been one of anger or revenge, but he had chosen to rise above it. And in doing so, he had given her something she didn't know she needed: perspective. Sometimes, it takes hitting rock bottom or a breaking point to reevaluate what truly matters. Whether you're the one making a mistake or the one on the receiving end, the choice to respond with grace and compassion can change lives. The power to forgive and rise above isn't just noble, it's transformative. If this story moved you, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. How would you handle a moment like this? Subscribe for more thought-provoking stories that remind us of the strength in humanity. Let's keep the conversation going.